My 9-year-old daughter got home from school and her key did not fit the front door. She sat for 5 grueling hours in the freezing Atlanta rain, waiting for someone to let her in. When my mother finally stepped onto the porch, she threw a broken umbrella at my little girl and calmly stated that the family had decided we do not live there anymore. I did not shout, I did not beg. I simply looked my mother dead in the eye and said one single word: understood. 3 days later, my mother received a certified legal letter that would completely destroy her carefully curated high society life. Before I dive into the details of this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who grossly underestimated your worth. My name is Tiana, and I am 32 years old. The torrential downpour that flooded the streets of Atlanta that Tuesday afternoon was nothing compared to the absolute panic rising in my chest. I had been stuck in bumper-to-bumper traffic on Interstate 85 when my phone buzzed with a message from my daughter Brielle. Her text simply said, "Mommy, my key is not working, and I'm so cold." I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. We lived in my family's sprawling colonial estate in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the city. My mother, Beatrice, controlled that house like a tyrant ruling a small nation. I pressed the gas pedal down the moment traffic cleared, navigating the winding tree-lined streets of our upper-class neighborhood. The mansions around me stood tall and imposing, shielding their wealthy occupants from the severe weather. But as I pulled into our long circular driveway, my headlights caught a sight that made my blood run entirely cold. There, sitting on the wet concrete steps leading up to the grand double doors, was my 9-year-old daughter. She was huddled into a tight ball, her small school uniform soaked completely through her backpack, shielding her head from the relentless freezing rain. I slammed the car into park and leaped out, leaving the engine running and the door wide open. The rain instantly soaked my business suit, but I did not care. I sprinted up the driveway screaming Brielle's name. When I reached her, her lips were tinged with a frightening shade of blue, and she was shivering so violently she could barely speak. "Mommy," she whispered, her teeth chattering. Grandma locked the door. She said I could not come inside. I pulled off my suit jacket and wrapped it tightly around her small, trembling shoulders. That was when I noticed the object sitting just a few feet away from us on the pristine white columns of the porch. 3 heavy black plastic garbage bags sat slumped in the rain. One of them had torn open slightly near the top, revealing Brielle's favorite stuffed animal and my collection of business law books. They had packed our lives into trash bags and thrown them outside like literal garbage. Rage, unlike anything I had ever experienced, ignited in my chest. I pounded my fist against the heavy mahogany door. The brass knocker echoed loudly over the sound of the thunderstorm. I pounded again and again, ignoring the stinging pain in my hand. Finally, the deadbolt clicked. The heavy door cracked open just a few inches. My mother, Beatrice, stood there, looking perfectly put together. Not a single strand of her chemically relaxed hair was out of place. She wore a silk lounging robe and held a crystal glass of expensive red wine in her manicured hand. The warm, golden light from the foyer spilled out onto the porch, casting a mocking glow over my freezing child. "What is all this racket, Tiana?" my mother asked, her voice dripping with aristocratic annoyance. She looked down at Brielle, then at the trash bags, then back at me, without a single ounce of maternal warmth or human empathy. "Mom, what did you do?" I demanded, pulling Brielle closer to my side. "Why are our things in garbage bags in the rain? Why is the lock changed?" Beatrice took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine. "The family had a meeting this afternoon, Tiana. We came to a consensus that this living arrangement is simply no longer viable. You and your daughter need to find somewhere else to reside. We changed the locks for security purposes." I stared at her, completely stunned by the casual cruelty of her words. "Security purposes," I repeated, my voice trembling with suppressed fury. "It is 40 degrees outside and pouring rain. You left your own granddaughter sitting in a storm for 5 hours. Beatrice rolled her eyes, stepping back slightly as if the damp air was offending her delicate sensibilities. "Do not be overly dramatic, Tiana. She is fine. Besides, you should have picked her up on time, instead of working whatever low-wage entry-level job you are pretending is a career these days. I felt a presence looming behind my mother. The door opened wider, revealing my older sister, Kiera, and her husband, Spencer. Kiera was the golden child of the family, a plastic surgeon who catered to the Atlanta elite. She looked at me with the same disdain she had worn since childhood. Spencer, a white financial executive who loved to flaunt his generational wealth and corporate authority, stood beside her with a smug, self-satisfied grin. He held a glass of bourbon swirling the amber liquid as he looked down at me from the entryway. "Look," Tiana, Spencer began using that condescending tone he always reserved for me. "We are trying to build a certain environment here. Kiera and I are planning to start a family soon. We need the extra space. Your room is going to be converted into a state-of-the-art home gym for us. You have to admit it makes sense. I am the vice president of a major investment firm, and Kiera is a top-tier surgeon. We are the ones who actually bring prestige and value to this family's legacy. You are just taking up space." Kiera chimed in, crossing her arms over her designer cashmere sweater. "Exactly. You have been a burden on this family since you got pregnant at 23. Mom has been generous enough to let you stay in this historical estate, but it is time you face reality. You are a single mother with no real degree and no real prospects. You are ruining the aesthetic of our household. Go find a cheap apartment in a neighborhood that fits your income bracket." The sheer audacity of their words hung heavily in the freezing air. They truly believed they were untouchable. They believed I was the same helpless, terrified college dropout from 9 years ago who relied on their charity. They believed their high society status and Spencer's white corporate privilege gave them the right to treat me and my daughter like discarded refuse. Beatrice reached into the foyer closet and pulled out a broken, faded umbrella. She tossed it casually onto the porch, where it landed in a puddle near my feet. Here she said, her tone flat and final. "Take this so the child does not catch a cold. We have guests coming from the church charity board in an hour, and I cannot have you two loitering on the front steps looking like vagrants. Run along now, Tiana. Try to make something of yourself for once." She began to close the door. 10 years ago, I would have broken down. I would have dropped to my knees and begged for her forgiveness. I would have promised to pay more rent, to clean the house, to do whatever it took to keep a roof over my daughter's head. But I was not that 22-year-old girl anymore. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not throw the umbrella back at her. I simply bent down, picked up Brielle in my arms, and looked my mother dead in the eyes. The absolute calm in my gaze must have unsettled her because her hand froze on the doorknob. "Understood," I said, just that one word, smooth, steady, and razor-sharp. Beatrice blinked, clearly expecting a fight, a hysterical breakdown, something she could use to further justify her cruelty. When she got nothing but ice-cold silence, she quickly shut the door and slid the deadbolt into place. I carried Brielle to the car and gently placed her in the heated passenger seat, buckling her in. I loaded the 3 soggy trash bags into the trunk, ruining the pristine carpet of my vehicle, but that did not matter right now. I climbed into the driver's seat and turned the heater up to its maximum setting. Brielle looked at me with wide, frightened eyes. "Mommy, where are we going to go?" she asked, her voice tiny and fragile. I reached over and stroked her damp hair, offering her a warm, reassuring smile. "We are going to a beautiful hotel tonight, sweetie. A really nice one. And tomorrow, we are going to go shopping for a brand new house. Just for us." She nodded slowly, trusting me completely, even though she had just watched her own grandmother lock her out in the cold. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the grand colonial estate. As we drove through the rain-slicked streets of Buckhead, I connected my phone to the car's Bluetooth system. I did not dial a cheap motel or a domestic shelter. I dialed the direct private line of my corporate legal counsel. The phone rang exactly twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Good evening, Ms. Tiana. This is the legal department. How can I assist you tonight?" I stared at the road ahead, my vision perfectly clear despite the pouring rain. My family thought I was a low-level office worker struggling to make ends meet. They thought my daily absences were due to grueling shifts at a dead-end job. They had absolutely no idea that over the past 9 years, I had relentlessly built a private equity fund specializing in real estate and healthcare acquisitions. I was not a receptionist. I was the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Equity, a firm worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And my dear arrogant family was completely oblivious to the fact that they did not own the home they had just kicked me out of. Execute Order 409. I instructed, my voice echoing cleanly through the car speakers. The lawyer on the other end of the line paused only for a fraction of a second. The residential foreclosure order on the Buckhead property, ma'am. Are you certain? 4 years ago, my mother Beatrice had a severe gambling and shopping addiction she hid behind her church-going facade. To keep up appearances, she had secretly taken out a massive second mortgage on the family estate. When she inevitably defaulted on the payments, the bank was preparing to seize the property and auction it off. To save her from public humiliation, I used a shell company to anonymously purchase the bad debt from the bank. I became the sole legal owner of the estate, holding the mortgage note in my private portfolio. I allowed her to continue living there, acting as the matriarch, believing she still owned the deed, because despite her flaws, she was my mother. But tonight she had forfeited that title the moment she left my child shivering in the rain. I am absolutely certain, I replied. Process the foreclosure immediately. I want the eviction notice filed, sealed, and delivered by the county sheriff. Give them exactly 72 hours to vacate the premises. No extensions, no negotiations. Understood, Miss Tiana. The paperwork will be filed first thing tomorrow morning. I ended the call and listened to the rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers. Spencer thought his corporate title gave him power over me. Kiara thought her medical degree made her superior. Beatrice thought her social standing at the church made her untouchable. They were all about to learn a very harsh, very permanent lesson about the real world. 3 days later, while Beatrice was hosting an elaborate afternoon tea party for the wealthy women of her church, the heavy brass knocker on the front door would sound. It would not be me standing in the rain. It would be 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies holding a red-stamped court order demanding she surrender the property immediately. The dominoes had been perfectly lined up, and tonight I had just pushed the very first one. It was exactly 72 hours later when my phone screen lit up with my sister's name. I was sitting on the plush velvet sofa of our temporary penthouse suite at the Four Seasons, watching Brielle eat room service pancakes with a smile that had finally returned to her face. The rain from that terrible night was gone, replaced by crisp morning sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I had promised my daughter a beautiful new life, and I was already delivering. But my family was just waking up to their nightmare. The caller ID flashed Kiara's name alongside a picture of her in her pristine white doctor's coat. I let it ring 3 times, taking a slow sip of my coffee before I finally swiped to answer. I did not even get a chance to say hello. Are you completely out of your mind? Kiara shrieked, her voice so loud I had to pull the phone slightly away from my ear. I can hear our mother sobbing from the hallway. You actually had the audacity to send some fake legal document to the house pretending you have the power to evict us. Who do you think you are dealing with, Tiana? I took another sip of my coffee, letting her manic energy burn itself out. I am dealing with trespassers, I said calmly. And the document is very real, Kiara. You are pathetic! Kiara spat the venom in her voice, dripping with years of practiced superiority. You have always been a jealous, bitter little failure, but this is a new low even for you. What is this, some kind of cheap blackmail stunt to get rent money because Mom finally kicked you out? Did you go to some strip mall lawyer and print out a fake court seal? You think because I am a respected plastic surgeon and Spencer is a top-tier financial executive that we are just going to hand over a check to make your little temper tantrum go away. We are the elite of this city. You are a glorified secretary, Tiana. You do not have the money, the influence, or the basic intelligence to pull off whatever con you think you are running. Listening to her rant, I was transported back to her medical school graduation party. Our mother had rented out a country club ballroom, spending thousands of dollars she barely had, just to parade Kiera in front of her high society friends. I had spent that entire day working a double shift at my first entry-level finance job, desperate to pay for Brielle's daycare. When I finally arrived at the party, exhausted and wearing a cheap off-the-rack dress, Kiera had looked me up and down and laughed. She told me to stay in the back near the kitchen doors, so my cheap shoes and tired face would not ruin the professional photography she had hired. Our mother had nodded in agreement, handing me a heavy tray of empty champagne flutes to carry away to the catering staff. They had always treated my existence as a stain on their perfect canvas, a dark mark on the pristine image they sold to their church friends and country club associates. "Are you done speaking?" I asked, my voice remaining entirely steady. "I am going to have you arrested for fraud," Kiera continued, completely ignoring my question. "Mom is hyperventilating on the couch. She has her church charity board meeting this afternoon, and her nerves are completely shot because of your sick joke. You are a disgrace to this family. You got pregnant young, you dropped out to work menial jobs, and you have been dragging us down ever since. The house belongs to our mother. It is a historical estate. It is our legacy. You have absolutely no legal right to even step foot on the grass, let alone send an eviction notice." I set my coffee cup down on the glass table. The quiet clink seemed to echo in the spacious hotel suite. "That is where you are wrong, Kiera," I said, my tone shifting from conversational to absolute authority. "Mom does not own that house. She has not owned it for 4 years." The line went dead silent for a fraction of a second before Kiera let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "What are you talking about? Of course she owns it. Her name is on the deed." "Her name was on the deed," I corrected. "But you see, Kiera, while you were busy playing the wealthy doctor and Mom was busy playing the ultimate high society matriarch, someone had to actually pay the bills. Did you never wonder how Mom afforded those $50,000 charity donations? Did you never question how she bought those new designer bags every season or funded your lavish wedding to Spencer? She did not have the income for that lifestyle. She had a severe shopping addiction and a desperate need to impress women who secretly despised her behind her back." "You are lying," Kiera stammered, but I could hear the first seed of doubt taking root in her voice. "To fund that fake lifestyle," I continued relentlessly, "Mom secretly took out a massive second mortgage on the estate. She drained every single drop of equity dry. And because she has absolutely no financial literacy, she defaulted on the payments. The bank was preparing to foreclose 4 years ago. They were going to publicly seize the house and auction it off to the highest bidder. It would have been on the front page of the local business journal. Mom would have been the laughingstock of her precious church council." "Shut up," Kiera breathed, her breathing growing shallow and panicked. I did not shut up. I pressed harder. "I knew about the default because I monitor those specific types of distressed assets. So I used one of my corporate shell companies to anonymously purchase the bad debt directly from the bank. I bought the mortgage note for pennies on the dollar. I own the debt, Kiera. I own the paper. And because Mom failed to meet the terms of my specific grace period, I executed the foreclosure. The deed officially transferred to my holding company last month. You are not standing in your family legacy. You are squatting in my personal real estate portfolio." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of Beatrice wailing in the background. Kiera was processing the information, trying to find a loophole, a way to make me the liar she so desperately needed me to be. "You do not have that kind of money," she finally whispered, her voice stripped of its previous arrogance. "You are a single mom. You work in a cubicle. You could not afford to buy a mortgage note on a property worth millions." "It is amusing how little you know about me," I replied, leaning back against the velvet cushions. "You and Mom never bothered to ask what I actually do for a living. You assumed because I did not brag about it at dinner parties that I must be failing. For your information, I do not work in a cubicle. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Equity. I manage a private equity fund worth over $800 million. Buying Mom's bad debt was the financial equivalent of me buying a cup of morning coffee. No, Kiara gasped. No, that is impossible. Mom said you were an administrative assistant. Mom said you barely made rent. Mom sees what she wants to see, I said coldly. She wanted a scapegoat, and you wanted someone to look down on. I let you both believe whatever made you comfortable because it kept you out of my business. But you crossed the line when you left my daughter in the freezing rain. You threw my child out like garbage, Kiara. You let Mom lock the door on a 9-year-old girl. You brought this entirely upon yourselves. The eviction notice is real, and the sheriff will be there at 5 o'clock this evening to physically remove you if you are not already gone. I could hear a scuffle on the other end of the line. Muffled voices argued urgently. Kiara was clearly trying to explain what I had just said to someone else. Then the phone was snatched away and the audio quality shifted. Listen to me, Tiana. The voice was deep, commanding, and dripping with the kind of unearned confidence that only comes from a lifetime of extreme privilege. It was Spencer, my brother-in-law. The white financial executive who loved to treat our family gatherings like his own personal kingdom. He always spoke to me as if I were a slow child who needed simple concepts explained slowly. Spencer, I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat. I assume Kiara just gave you the bad news. Kiara is hysterical right now because of your little prank, he said, his tone condescending and smooth. I do not know what kind of game you think you are playing, or what fake internet registry you use to print out these documents, but it ends right now. I work in high finance, Tiana. I am a vice president at Vanguard Trust. I know exactly how commercial real estate and private equity work, and I know for an absolute fact that a college dropout like you does not secretly own a private equity firm. You probably watch too many movies and think you can outsmart the system. I remained silent, letting him dig his grave deeper. You are angry because your mother asked you to leave. Spencer continued, his voice taking on a paternalistic lecturing quality. I get it. It is embarrassing. But you do not understand the fire you are playing with here. Forging court documents is a felony. Claiming to own a property you have no rights to is fraud. You are completely out of your depth. I am going to do you a huge favor right now because you are my wife's sister. If you call off this fake eviction and admit you made this whole thing up, I will not call the police. I will even write you a personal check for $10,000 to help you find a little apartment somewhere appropriate for you and your kid. A bribe. He was trying to bribe me with pocket change while mansplaining my own industry to me. And if I decline your generous offer, I asked mildly. Spencer let out a short, arrogant chuckle. Then I make one phone call to my firm's corporate lawyers. They are sharks, Tiana. They destroy people for a living. They will drag you into court. They will expose this little fraud stunt of yours, and they will bury you in so much legal debt you will never recover. They will take whatever custody you have of your daughter and make sure you end up in a jail cell. You do not understand high finance, and you certainly do not understand the kind of power I wield in this city. Stop playing pretend. Welcome to the real world, kid. I closed my eyes for a brief second, savoring the absolute perfection of this moment. Spencer thought he held all the cards. He thought his corporate title and his expensive suits made him a god. He had no idea he was talking to his boss. Welcome to the real world, Spencer. I echoed, my voice dropping an octave, chilling the air in the room. I find it fascinating that you are threatening me with the corporate lawyers at Vanguard Trust. Why is that fascinating? He scoffed. Because I said, checking my watch. I officially finalized the buyout of Vanguard Trust at 8 o'clock this morning. Apex Equity is now your parent company, which means your corporate lawyers work directly for me. There was no response. The heavy breathing on the other end of the line simply stopped. I let the silence stretch for a long, agonizing moment before delivering the final blow. Furthermore, Spencer, since I am now the owner of your firm, I took the liberty of running a preliminary internal audit on your specific department. It is amazing what you can find when you know where to look. What are you talking about? He choked out, his voice suddenly completely devoid of its former arrogance. I am talking about the $2.5 million you quietly embezzled from the Minority Workers Pension Fund over the last 3 years, I stated cleanly and clearly. The same $2.5 million you funneled through offshore accounts directly into Kiera's cosmetic surgery shell companies. You thought because you were dealing with working-class minority funds that no one would notice the discrepancies. You thought you were untouchable. You thought your privilege gave you a free pass to steal from hard-working people to fund your wife's fake luxury lifestyle. Tiana, wait! Spencer gasped, the panic finally breaking through. Let us talk about this. Please. We are done talking, I said. The auditors are turning their complete findings over to the federal authorities as we speak. You threatened to bury me, Spencer, but the truth is you have already dug your own grave. Enjoy the eviction. I ended the call and set the phone face down on the glass table. The dominoes were falling faster now and the crash was going to be spectacular. The morning after that phone call, the Atlanta skyline was completely clear of clouds. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office on the 50th floor of the Apex Equity Tower, looking down at the bustling city below. The storm had washed everything clean, leaving the streets gleaming in the early sunlight. My mind was perfectly still. I had spent the last 9 years building a financial empire in complete secrecy, driven by the burning need to ensure my daughter Brielle would never have to depend on anyone for her survival. Now that empire was going to serve a different purpose. It was going to be the instrument of my absolute justice. My intercom chimed, breaking the quiet atmosphere of the room. It was my executive assistant, David. His voice was smooth and perfectly professional. Ms. Tiana, there is a Spencer Hayes in the main lobby. He is making quite a scene demanding to see you. He claims he is your brother-in-law and says he is here to save you from getting yourself arrested. I could not help the small, genuine smile that touched my lips. Spencer had actually come. After I dropped the bombshell on him over the phone last night, his fragile, massive ego simply could not process the information. His brain fundamentally refused to believe that the black sheep of the family, the single mother he loved to mock at Thanksgiving dinners, could possibly be the chief executive officer of the firm that just bought his company. In his mind, I was just a desperate liar who had somehow learned the name of his acquiring parent company and was playing a pathetic prank. Send him up to the private boardroom, David, I instructed, keeping my voice light and pleasant. Do not offer him coffee. Just put him in the room and let him wait for exactly 15 minutes before you come get me. Understood, ma'am, David replied. I took my time. I reviewed the quarterly acquisition reports, signed off on a merger in London, and checked my phone to see a picture Brielle had drawn for me while eating her room service breakfast at the hotel. She was safe and happy and warm. That was all the motivation I needed. When 15 minutes had passed, I picked up a single red folder from my desk, smoothed down the skirt of my tailored designer suit, and walked down the glass-walled corridor toward the executive boardroom. When I pushed the heavy oak doors open, Spencer was pacing the length of the room. He looked ridiculous. He was wearing a custom navy suit that probably cost him a month of his salary, paired with a luxury watch he undoubtedly bought on credit, just to project an image of wealth. When he saw me walk in, his posture immediately shifted into that familiar, arrogant stance. He puffed out his chest and let out a long, condescending sigh. I have to admit, Tiana, you almost had me going last night, he said, his voice echoing in the large acoustic space. He gestured around the magnificent boardroom with a dismissive wave of his hand. This is a nice little setup you have here. Did you sneak into your boss's conference room while he was in a meeting just to play dress-up? You know, if the actual executives catch you in here, you are going to lose whatever low-level admin job you managed to scrape together. I did not respond to his bait. I simply walked to the head of the massive mahogany table, pulled out the leather chair, and sat down. I placed the red folder neatly in front of me and folded my hands. Please sit down, Spencer, I said, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. He scoffed, shaking his head as if he were dealing with a stubborn toddler. He pulled out the chair opposite me and sat, leaning back aggressively and crossing one leg over his knee. I am not here to play your little corporate fantasy games, Tiana. I am here to clean up the mess you made. Kiera was crying all night because of your fake eviction notice. Beatrice is completely humiliated. Do you have any idea what kind of stress you are putting on this family? My wife is a prominent surgeon, and my mother-in-law is a pillar of her church. They do not have time for your ghetto drama. He reached into his expensive leather briefcase and pulled out 2 pieces of paper. He slid them across the polished mahogany table toward me. The first document was a legal waiver. The second was a personal check written out from his joint account with my sister. "Here's how this is going to work," he dictated, leaning forward, resting his elbows on the table to try and physically intimidate me. "That is a non-disclosure agreement and a formal relinquishment of any and all claims you might think you have to the family estate. You are going to sign it right now. In exchange, I am going to be the bigger person and give you this check for $10,000. That is more money than you make in half a year. You can take this cash, find a cheap apartment in a neighborhood where you actually belong, and disappear. If you sign this today, I will call off my firm's lawyers and I will not press federal fraud charges against you for faking a bank foreclosure." I looked down at the check. $10,000. To Spencer, that was a grand gesture. He truly believed he was a white knight swooping in to save the poor, uneducated black woman from her own stupidity. He expected me to see those zeros and burst into tears of gratitude. I looked from the checkup to his smug, self-satisfied face. "You think $10,000 is a lot of money, Spencer?" I asked, my voice dangerously soft. "For you, it is a fortune." He shot back a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Do not be proud, Tiana. You have a kid to feed. Take the money and go away before I decide to be less generous." I slowly picked up the check and tore it perfectly in half. Then I placed the pieces together and tore them again, letting the shreds flutter down onto the pristine tabletop. Spencer's face went bright red. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he yelled, slamming his hand on the table. "I am offering you a way out of prison, you stupid girl. When my corporate legal team gets hold of your little foreclosure stunt, they are going to ruin your life. Vanguard Trust does not play around with fraudulent claims." Right on cue, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open. David, my assistant, walked in, flanked by my chief operating officer and the head of my corporate legal department. They did not even glance at Spencer. They walked directly to my end of the table and placed a thick stack of bound documents in front of me. "Mrs. Tiana," my chief operating officer said respectfully, "the final signatures for the Vanguard Trust acquisition have cleared the regulatory board. As of 9 o'clock this morning, Apex Equity is officially the sole owner of Vanguard. We have completely dissolved their previous board of directors. You now have full operational control over all their assets and personnel." "Thank you, Marcus," I said, nodding to him. "Please inform their Human Resources Department that I will be making some immediate structural changes to their executive leadership team." "Absolutely, Ma," Marcus replied, gathering his things and quietly exiting the room with the legal head and David. The silence that fell over the boardroom after the doors closed was suffocating. I looked back at Spencer. The angry red flush on his face had completely vanished, replaced by a sickly, chalky white. His mouth hung open slightly and his eyes darted from the door to the stack of acquisition documents sitting in front of me. His brain was violently trying to reject reality, but the polished demeanor of my executive team and the sheer scale of the boardroom were making it impossible. You work here," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The arrogant edge was entirely gone. "I do not work here, Spencer," I corrected him, leaning forward, mirroring the exact aggressive posture he had used earlier. "I own here. I built Apex Equity from nothing while you and my sister were busy treating me like trash. I bought the bank debt on my mother's house because I had the cash lying around, and I felt sorry for her. But you all pushed me too far when you decided my 9-year-old daughter was not good enough to wait inside your precious home out of the freezing rain." Spencer swallowed hard. A bead of sweat broke out on his forehead, tracking slowly down his temple. "Tiana, listen." He started raising his hands defensively. "I had no idea. Kiera told me you were just an administrative assistant. She said you were struggling. If I had known you were the one behind the Vanguard acquisition, we could have talked about this professional to professional. We are family, after all. We should be working together, not against each other." The utter hypocrisy of his words made me sick. 10 minutes ago I was ghetto drama. Now that he realized I held his entire career in the palm of my hand, I was family. "We are not family, Spencer," I said, my voice turning to absolute ice. "And we are certainly not professionals on the same level. You make a few $100,000 a year playing with other people's money. You lease luxury cars and finance expensive suits to pretend you are a titan of industry. You are nothing but a middle management employee who married into what you thought was old money. But you are about to find out exactly how broke my mother and sister really are. I reached out and placed my hand on the red folder I had brought in with me. I slowly slid it across the mahogany table until it bumped against the torn pieces of his pathetic $10,000 check. As part of the Vanguard acquisition, I initiated an intense internal audit of all executive-level transactions over the past 36 months. I explained, watching his eyes drop to the red folder, as if it were a venomous snake. I wanted to see exactly what kind of talent I was inheriting. And do you know what my forensic accountants found when they looked into your specific department, Spencer? He did not speak. He looked as though all the air had been vacuumed out of his lungs. His hands were gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles were white. I opened the folder and read from the top sheet. They found a very interesting series of ghost transactions. It seems that over the last 3 years, exactly $2.5 million has been quietly siphoned out of the Municipal Workers' Pension Fund. A fund, I might add, that primarily serves working-class black men and women in this city. People who actually work for a living. People like I used to be. Spencer began to shake. "Tiana, please," he choked out the words barely audible. "You do not understand." "I understand perfectly," I continued, my voice rising with authority, pinning him to his seat. "You thought you were so much smarter than everyone else. You thought nobody would notice a few missing percentage points from a working-class retirement pool. But the digital trail is incredibly clear, Spencer. You funneled every single cent of that $2.5 million through 3 different offshore accounts and deposited it directly into the shell companies that control Kiera's cosmetic surgery clinic." "No, no, no," Spencer muttered, shaking his head frantically side to side. "It was a loan. I was going to put it back. Kiera needed capital for her new operating equipment. She told me the clinic was expanding. She promised we would replace the funds before the quarterly reviews." I closed the red folder with a sharp snap that made him flinch. "You stole retirement money from vulnerable people to fund my sister's fake luxury lifestyle. You stood on my porch last night and talked about how you and Kiera bring prestige to the family legacy. You called me a burden. But the truth is, you are nothing but a common thief hiding behind a nice suit and corporate privilege." I stood up from my chair, towering over him. The illusion of his power was completely shattered. He was just a terrified criminal caught in a trap he had built with his own arrogance. "My lawyers are not going to drag you into court, Spencer," I said, looking down at his sweating, trembling form. "Because I'm turning this entire red folder over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation in exactly 5 minutes. Embezzling pension funds is a federal crime. You are going to go to prison for a very long time. And while you are sitting in a federal cell, you can think about that umbrella my mother threw at my daughter. Welcome to the real world, kid." I left Spencer gasping for air in the boardroom. The heavy oak doors closed behind me, shutting away his pathetic whimpers. My chief operating officer, Marcus, matched my pace as we walked down the glass corridor. He informed me that the federal authorities were already reviewing the files. I simply nodded, feeling a profound sense of clarity. My phone vibrated in the pocket of my tailored suit. It was a message from an informant I had quietly placed within my mother's inner social circle. The text contained a live audio link and a brief message explaining that Beatrice was currently hosting an emergency high tea at the prestigious Peachtree Rose Country Club. I signaled to my assistant David to pull up the feed on my tablet. Through the crisp audio, I could hear the clinking of fine porcelain teacups and the hushed, dramatic gasps of Atlanta's most influential Black elite women. Beatrice was holding court. Her voice dripped with manufactured sorrow as she spun a web of absolute lies. She told the wives of judges, pastors, and city councilmen that I had suffered a severe psychotic break. She claimed I had shown up at the family estate in the middle of a thunderstorm, screaming incoherently and attempting to physically assault her. She even went as far as to say that my 9-year-old daughter Brielle was terrified of me and that Kiera was currently looking into emergency psychiatric holds to save me from myself. Beatrice seamlessly wove a narrative of a tragic mother dealing with a dangerously unhinged daughter. She claimed the eviction notice was a fake document I had printed from the internet in a fit of delusional rage. I listened as the prominent women murmured their sympathies, offering prayers and legal advice to protect the family legacy from my supposed madness. Beatrice was trying to strike first. She knew the eviction was real, but she believed that if she controlled the narrative and destroyed my reputation among the city elite, she could use their collective power to pressure me into backing down. She thought social humiliation would force me into submission, just like it had when I was a teenager. I handed the tablet back to David. "Cancel my afternoon meetings," I instructed. "Have my driver bring the car around. We are going to the country club." David nodded, tapping his earpiece to make the arrangements. The Peachtree Rose Country Club was an institution in Atlanta. It was a sprawling estate with manicured golf courses, towering oak trees, and an exclusive membership list that required a 10-year waiting period and unanimous board approval. Beatrice had spent decades climbing the social ladder just to secure a basic membership. She practically lived on the terrace, sipping imported tea and judging anyone whose pedigree did not meet her artificial standards. What Beatrice did not know was that the club had been facing quiet financial ruin for the past 18 months. Mismanagement had left them drowning in operational debt. Apex Equity had stepped in quietly, acquiring a controlling interest in the property and restructuring the board of directors. I had personally taken the seat as chairwoman only 2 weeks prior. My black town car pulled past the wrought iron gates of the club. The security guards immediately recognized the vehicle and scrambled to open the barriers. As we pulled up to the grand entrance, the club general manager, a tall man named Harrison, was already waiting on the steps. He rushed forward to open my door, bowing his head respectfully. "Welcome, Madam Chairwoman," Harrison said, his voice carrying genuine deference. "We were not expecting you today." I stepped out of the car, smoothing my suit jacket. "I am making an impromptu visit, Harrison. I understand my mother Beatrice is hosting a gathering on the South Terrace." "Yes, ma-am," Harrison replied, falling into step behind me as I walked through the grand lobby. "She reserved the Magnolia section for a private tea service. Shall I announce your arrival?" "That will not be necessary," I said. "I will announce myself." The club members we passed stopped and stared. They recognized the general manager walking subserviently behind me, and whispers immediately began to ripple through the dining rooms. I ignored them, keeping my eyes fixed straight ahead. The double French doors leading to the south terrace were open, letting in the warm afternoon breeze. I stepped onto the terrace and took in the scene. A dozen women draped in pastel dresses and wide-brimmed hats sat around a long table adorned with tiered cake stands and silver teapots. At the head of the table sat my mother. She was dabbing the corner of her eye with a lace handkerchief, performing the role of the heartbroken matriarch with absolute perfection. Sitting directly to her right was First Lady Higgins, the wife of the most powerful megachurch pastor in the state. "It is just so difficult." Beatrice was sighing heavily. "I love Tiana, I really do, but her mental state has become a danger to us all. We are praying for a miracle before she ends up hurting herself or that poor child." I stepped fully onto the patio, my hard leather heels clicking sharply against the stone floor. "It is fascinating to hear you pray for a miracle, Mother," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the gentle sound of the terrace fountain. "Especially when you are the one creating the nightmare." The entire table froze. A dozen heads snapped in my direction. Beatrice dropped her lace handkerchief, her mouth falling open in genuine shock. She stared at me, taking in my tailored designer suit and the absolute lack of hesitation in my posture. This was not the broken girl she had thrown out of the house. "Tiana." Beatrice gasped, recovering quickly and plastering on a look of panicked concern. "What are you doing here? How did you get past the gate guards?" She turned immediately to the women around her. "You see what I mean. She is stalking me. She is completely unhinged. Beatrice stood up abruptly and waved frantically at a passing waiter. You there, call security immediately. My daughter is having an episode and needs to be removed from the premises. The waiter looked panicked, but before he could move, Harrison stepped out from behind me. Harrison, deal with this woman, Beatrice demanded, pointing a shaking finger at me. She is trespassing and harassing a club member. Harrison did not move toward me. Instead, he looked directly at my mother with a cold, professional stare. I am sorry, Beatrice, but I cannot do that. Ms. Tiana is not trespassing. Oh. What do you mean you cannot do that? Beatrice shrieked, dropping the refined accent she usually faked for her friends. I pay my membership dues. I demand she be removed. Harrison folded his hands behind his back. Beatrice Ms. Tiana is the new chairwoman of the board of directors for the Peachtree Rose Country Club. She is the majority owner of this entire establishment. She has every right to be here. In fact, she technically owns the chair you are sitting on. The collective gasp from the elite women at the table was audible. First Lady Higgins almost dropped her porcelain teacup. Beatrice looked as though she had been physically struck. She stumbled back a step, hitting the edge of the table. The color completely drained from her face. That is a lie, she stammered, her eyes darting frantically around the terrace. That is impossible. She does not have that kind of money. She is a low-wage worker. She is crazy. I walked slowly toward the table, commanding the space with every step. You have always relied on the assumption that I would stay quiet to protect your image, Mother, I said, resting my hands on the back of an empty chair. You gathered the most influential women in Atlanta today to poison my name. You thought if you convinced them I was insane, I would be too ashamed to follow through with the eviction. You wanted to use their social power to crush me. I turned my attention to the women sitting at the table. Ladies, I apologize for interrupting your afternoon tea. My mother has been telling you a very compelling story about my mental health and my supposed financial ruin. She claims the eviction notice she received is a forgery. I assure you it is a legally binding document. My mother secretly mortgaged her home to fund her shopping addiction, and I bought the debt when she defaulted. Do not listen to her! Beatrice yelled, her voice shrill and desperate. She is making this all up. She is trying to humiliate me. She is a sick, jealous girl. I smiled coldly. I knew you would deny it, Mother. You have built your entire life on a foundation of lies and projected wealth. But since you brought up the topic of financial fraud, let us talk about your role as the head of the church charity committee. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I connected it seamlessly to the terrace surround sound system, which I had instructed Harrison to pair with my device before I arrived. First Lady Higgins, I said, looking directly at the pastor's wife. I believe you spearheaded the recent donation drive to build the new community center for the underprivileged youth program. You trusted my mother to manage those funds, did you not? First Lady Higgins nodded slowly, her expression guarded but intensely curious. Yes. Beatrice has controlled the charity ledger for the past 4 years. I tapped the screen of my phone. A crisp, clear audio recording began to play through the hidden speakers around the terrace. It was a recording from a phone call Beatrice had made to Kiera just 3 weeks ago. I had gained access to it during my investigation into Spencer's embezzlement, as the financial webs were all interconnected. Beatrice's voice echoed across the patio, sharp and mocking. Oh, Kiera, please do not worry about the credit card bill. I am transferring the money right now. Those churchwomen are so gullible, it is actually pathetic. Higgins handed over the collection plates without even checking the secondary ledger. I skimmed $15,000 just this morning. I'm going to buy that limited edition Hermes bag we saw in Paris, and nobody will ever know. Let the poor kids play basketball in the street for all I care. I need those Chanel heels for the gala. I paused the recording. The silence on the terrace was absolute. The women sat frozen, staring at Beatrice, with expressions of pure, unadulterated disgust. The illusion of the pious, wealthy matriarch shattered into a million irreparable pieces right before their eyes. First Lady Higgins stood up slowly, her chair scraping loudly against the stone. Her face was a mask of righteous fury. "You stole from the community center," Higgins said, her voice trembling with rage. "You stole money meant for hungry children to buy handbags. You sat in my home, drank my tea, and prayed with my husband while you were robbing our congregation blind." "Wait, please," Beatrice begged, reaching out toward the pastor's wife. "That audio is fake. Tiana faked it using computers. She is trying to frame me." "Do not insult my intelligence," Beatrice Higgins snapped, pulling her arm away as if Beatrice were diseased. "We are done here. I am calling a full emergency audit of the church finances this evening. If a single penny is missing, I will personally see to it that you are prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." One by one, the elite women stood up from the table. They gathered their purses and cast looks of absolute contempt at my mother. None of them spoke to her. They simply walked away, leaving their half-empty teacups behind. Within 2 minutes, the lavish table was completely abandoned except for Beatrice, who stood shaking with anger and humiliation. She turned to me, her eyes filled with a toxic, venomous hatred. "You ruined me!" she hissed. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You destroyed my reputation. You took my friends. You took my home." "I took nothing that belonged to you," I said calmly. "I simply removed the mask you have been hiding behind for decades. You built your life on stolen money and discarded family. The real world has finally caught up with you, Mother." Beatrice took a step toward me, her face contorted into an ugly snarl. "You think you have won?" She spat, her voice dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper. "You think, because you have some money and a fancy title, that you have beaten us. You are a fool, Tiana. You do not know everything. Your father was not the saint you thought he was. Before he died, he left a secondary will. A real will. It details offshore accounts and hidden assets worth more than your entire little equity firm. And he left every single penny of it to Kiera. You get absolutely nothing. You will always be the loser of this family." I did not blink. I did not flinch. I looked at the desperate, broken woman standing before me, grasping at imaginary lifelines to save her shattered ego. I let a slow, dark smirk spread across my face. "Are you sure about that, Mother? Are you sure about that, Mother?" I asked, letting the question hang in the heavy air of the country club terrace. Beatrice stared up at me, her face pale and trembling. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could utter a single lie, the heavy glass doors of the patio swung open violently. Everyone turned to look. Striding onto the terrace with the kind of aggressive entitlement that only she possessed was my older sister, Kiera. She was wearing her pristine white doctor coat over a tailored designer dress, her stethoscope draped casually around her neck like a trophy. She must have rushed over straight from her clinic after Beatrice texted her in a panic earlier. Her heels struck the stone floor with sharp, angry clicks as she marched directly toward our table, completely ignoring the stunned faces of Atlanta's elite women who were still lingering near the exit. "What exactly do you think you are doing, Tiana?" Kiera demanded, her voice ringing out across the patio. "I received a frantic message from Mom saying you were here harassing her and causing a scene." I looked at her calmly. "I am not causing a scene, Kiera. I am simply holding a mirror up to our mother." Kiera scoffed loudly, tossing her expensive leather handbag onto an empty chair. "You are so pathetic, Tiana. You walk in here in a nice suit and you think you can suddenly dictate terms to us. You think having a little bit of new money makes you better than this family. You are nothing but a glorified accountant who got lucky. I am a board-certified plastic surgeon. I save lives. I enhance beauty. I cater to the highest tier of society in this city. A doctor's social standing will always crush whatever new money scheme you are running today. You will never command the respect that I do." First Lady Higgins and the other women watched the exchange in absolute silence. Some of them were Kiera's actual clients. They touched their faces nervously as the tension on the terrace grew thick enough to cut with a knife. "You talk a lot about respect, Kiera," I said, my voice smooth and unwavering. "But respect is earned. It is not bought with stolen money." Beatrice tried to grab Kiera's arm. "Kiera, stop," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Do not provoke her. She knows about the mortgage. She knows everything. But Kiara was too blind with arrogance to listen. She yanked her arm away from our mother and glared at me. I do not care what she thinks she knows, Mom. She is a college dropout trying to intimidate a medical professional. Tiana, you need to leave right now before I call the authorities and have you committed. Mom already told me about Father's real will. We know all about the offshore assets he left entirely to me. You get nothing. You will always have nothing. I let out a soft laugh, shaking my head slowly. It is truly incredible how easily you both believe your own delusions, I said, taking a step closer to my sister. Let us talk about those hidden offshore assets Mother was just bragging about. Because my forensic accountants found those too. They were not a secret stash of money our father left for his golden child. Kiara crossed her arms over her chest. You are lying. You are just jealous. Those offshore accounts were set up by our grandfather. I continued projecting my voice so every woman on the terrace could hear perfectly. They were a trust fund meant for both of us to share equally. But Mother gained access to the accounts when I was 18, and she drained my entire half. And do you want to know what she used those millions of dollars for, Kiara? Kiara's arrogant smirk began to falter. She glanced down at Beatrice, whose eyes were wide with pure terror. She used my inheritance to bribe your way into medical school, I stated cleanly and clearly. That is a filthy lie, Kiara shrieked, stepping forward. I earned my degree. I studied for years. I am a top-tier surgeon. You failed your medical college admission test 3 consecutive times, Kiara, I countered smoothly. You were rejected by every single legitimate medical program in the country. Your grades were absolute garbage. Mother took my trust fund and wired $2 million to a private offshore medical school in the Caribbean just to secure your acceptance. She bought your degree. She bought your entire career. You are not a genius doctor. You are a fraud who could not pass a basic biology exam without Mommy writing a check. The collective gasp from the elite women was deafening. First Lady Higgins took a step back, staring at Kiara with undisguised horror. Several other women who had frequented Kiara's clinic began whispering urgently among themselves. Kiara was hyperventilating now. Her pristine white coat suddenly looked like a cheap costume. You cannot prove any of that, she stammered, her voice losing all its power. My patients love me. I run the most profitable cosmetic clinic in Buckhead. I have a legitimate medical license. I tilted my head slightly, watching her unravel. A profitable clinic, yes. But let us discuss exactly how you maximize those profits, Kiara. Because my audit of your husband Spencer did not just reveal his embezzlement. It revealed where the stolen money was going. Kiara froze. Her eyes darted wildly. Spencer, she whispered. Spencer stole $2.5 million from a working-class minority pension fund to keep your clinic afloat, I explained methodically. But even with that stolen money, your lifestyle was too expensive. You needed larger profit margins. So you started cutting corners. Very dangerous corners. Shut up, Tiana, Kiara begged, holding her hands up. Shut up right now. But I did not stop. I turned to face the women of the country club. Ladies, I highly recommend you consult new physicians immediately, because the financial audit revealed that Dr. Kiara Hayes has been purchasing black market medical supplies for the past 2 years. She has been injecting counterfeit Botox and using industrial-grade silicone in her procedures to save money. She has been treating the elite women of Atlanta like human guinea pigs just to fund her designer wardrobe. A woman in a yellow floral dress let out a loud shriek, clutching her cheeks. First Lady Higgins looked as though she was going to be physically ill. You injected me 3 weeks ago, Higgins cried, pointing a shaking finger at Kiara. You put that poison in my face. No, Kiara cried out, backing away from the angry women. It is not true. It is perfectly safe. The distributor said it was safe. You just admitted you used an unauthorized distributor, I pointed out calmly. And you should probably know that the federal authorities are raiding your clinic right this very moment. They have all the shipping manifests, the fake invoices, and the bank records showing you knowingly purchased illegal medical-grade materials. Your medical license is already gone, Kiara. The only question now is how many years you are going to spend in a federal penitentiary. Beatrice was sobbing openly now, her face buried in her hands. The pristine image she had spent a lifetime cultivating was completely incinerated. She was the mother of a fraud, a thief, and a criminal. She had stolen from the church, and her daughter had poisoned the community. Kiara was completely frantic. She began digging through her expensive leather handbag, tossing makeup and keys onto the stone floor until she found her phone. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely unlock the screen. "I am calling Spencer," she mumbled frantically, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Spencer will fix this. He has the best corporate lawyers in the city. His firm will shut this down. He knows judges. He knows politicians. He will save me." I stood perfectly still, watching her press the phone to her ear. I knew exactly what Spencer was doing right now. I had left him in my boardroom surrounded by auditors and federal evidence. "Pick up! Pick up! Pick up!" Kiara chanted, pacing in a tight circle. Finally, the line connected. "Spencer," she cried, her voice cracking with absolute desperation. "Spencer, you have to help me. Tiana is at the country club. She knows about the clinic. She knows about the medical supplies. The feds are raiding the office, Spencer. You have to call your legal team right now. Tell them to issue a gag order. Tell them to stop the raid. You have to fix this." The patio was dead silent. Every single woman, including our sobbing mother, was staring at Kiara, waiting for the powerful financial executive to swoop in and save the day. The speaker volume on Kiara's phone was loud enough that Spencer's voice carried across the terrace. It did not sound like the booming, arrogant voice of a corporate vice president. It sounded like a broken, terrified man. "I cannot help you," Kiara Spencer said, his voice hollow and dead. "What do you mean you cannot help me?" Kiara shrieked, gripping the phone with both hands. "You are a vice president at Vanguard Trust. Call the lawyer Spencer. Save me." "There are no lawyers," Kiara Spencer replied, a bitter, broken sob escaping his throat. "Tiana owns Vanguard Trust. She bought the whole company. She initiated the audit. The feds are here, Kiara. They are in my office. They have the pension fund records. They have everything. I am too busy trying to save myself from federal prison to worry about you. Do not ever call this number again." The line went dead with a sharp click. Kiara stood frozen, her phone pressed against her ear as the dial tone beeped endlessly. The realization washed over her face, draining away the last remnants of her arrogance. Her husband had abandoned her. Her medical career was destroyed. Her freedom was gone. The heavy phone slipped from her trembling fingers and shattered against the stone floor of the terrace. The Sunday service at a Greater Hope Fellowship was the social pinnacle of Atlanta's Black elite. Beatrice had attended this church for 30 years, using her position as the head of the charity committee to mask her financial decay. Today, she had called an emergency meeting of the church council. She stood at the grand pulpit, wearing a conservative black dress, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. She was performing her final desperate act, trying to weaponize the congregation against me. "Brothers and sisters," Beatrice cried, her voice echoing through the massive sanctuary, "I stand before you, a broken mother. My daughter Tiana has lost her mind to greed. She is trying to illegally evict me from my home, and she is spreading vicious lies about our family's finances. I am asking the council to formally excommunicate her today to show her that this holy community stands against such evil and disrespect." The congregation murmured in sympathy. The head pastor, a dignified man named Reverend Carter, raised his hands for silence. He looked at Beatrice with pity, preparing to call for the vote. But suddenly, the massive projection screens flanking the pulpit flickered to life. The organ player stopped abruptly. I did not show up in person to beg for their forgiveness. Instead, my face appeared 50 feet tall on the screens broadcasting live from my corporate office. "Good morning, Greater Hope Fellowship," I said, my voice booming clearly through the church surround sound system. "I apologize for interrupting the service, but since my mother is currently standing at the pulpit asking for my excommunication, I thought it was only fair that the congregation hear the truth about who has actually been keeping the lights on in this building." Beatrice gasped, gripping the edges of the wooden pulpit. "Cut the feed!" she screamed, pointing frantically at the audio-visual team in the balcony. "Turn it off right now!" Reverend Carter stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "Let her speak, Beatrice." "Thank you, Reverend," I continued. "For the past 5 years, this church was on the brink of absolute bankruptcy. You all prayed for a miracle to save the foundation. What you did not know is that I am the anonymous major donor who completely paid off the church's mortgage. I am the one who funded the new community center. I own the debt of this building, just like I own the debt of my mother's foreclosed mansion." The sanctuary erupted into shocked gasps. Reverend Carter stared up at the screen in absolute disbelief. "But my generosity is not the issue today," I stated firmly, looking down at my mother's terrified face. "The issue is what Beatrice has been doing with the tithes and offerings of the hard-working families sitting in those pews." I pressed a button on my desk. The screen split in half. On one side was my face. On the other side, a highly detailed financial spreadsheet appeared, highlighting massive discrepancies in the church charity fund. As a condition of my anonymous donations, I required a silent audit of the church ledgers, I explained. My mother has been the head of the charity committee for 4 years. During that time, she has systematically embezzled over $200,000 from the youth outreach program and the homeless shelter fund. She funneled your tithes directly into her personal bank accounts to buy designer handbags, luxury shoes, and to maintain her fake high society image. "That is a lie!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice cracking with pure panic. "She is hacking the system. She is trying to frame me." "Is it a lie, Mother?" I asked coldly. I tapped my keyboard again. The spreadsheet disappeared, replaced by an audio file. The church was dead silent as Beatrice's own arrogant voice echoed through the speakers, bragging to Kiera about skimming $15,000 from the collection plates just to buy a limited edition Hermes bag in Paris. The sound of her own voice laughing about stealing from hungry children was the final nail in the coffin. The congregation erupted in absolute fury. People were standing up in the pews, pointing and yelling at the pulpit. The wealthy women who had pitied her moments ago now looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. Reverend Carter stepped up to the microphone, his face a mask of righteous anger. "Beatrice," he said, his voice shaking with absolute betrayal, "step down from that pulpit immediately. You are stripped of all your titles and duties within this congregation. You have stolen from the Lord, and you have stolen from this community. We do not need a vote to excommunicate your daughter, but I am calling for an immediate vote to permanently banish you from Greater Hope Fellowship." Beatrice looked out at the hundreds of furious faces. The illusion she had spent decades building was entirely incinerated. Her knees buckled beneath her. She let out a tragic wailing sob and collapsed right there on the altar steps, sobbing uncontrollably as the reality of her total social destruction finally set in. The heavy wooden doors of the sanctuary slammed shut behind my mother, leaving her collapsed on the carpet in a puddle of her own making. The excommunication had been absolute, and the congregation had watched her fall from grace in real time. But my work was not entirely finished. While Beatrice and Kiera were drowning in the public ruin of their own lies, Spencer was frantically swimming like a rat trying to escape a sinking ship. He knew the federal auditors from Apex Equity were closing in on him. He knew the $2.5 million he had embezzled from the minority pension fund was a crime that carried a mandatory federal prison sentence. But Spencer was a man born into extreme white corporate privilege, and men like him always believed they could sacrifice someone else to save themselves. 2 weeks after the church incident, the grand ballroom of the Atlanta Biltmore Hotel was illuminated by thousands of crystal chandeliers. Spencer had organized a massive charity gala. He had called in every favor, tapped into every old money connection his family possessed, and invited the absolute elite of the city's financial sector. He had spared no expense hiring a 50-piece symphony orchestra and ordering imported champagne. It was a calculated, desperate performance. I stood on the velvet-draped balcony overlooking the ballroom, watching him work the crowd. He was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo, projecting the image of a noble, wealthy man carrying a heavy burden. From my vantage point, I could see him holding court with a group of older white investment bankers. He was playing the victim with sickening perfection. I watched as he placed a hand over his heart, shaking his head mournfully. I could not hear his exact words over the swelling music, but I had already intercepted his emails and knew his strategy. He was telling them that he had been blinded by love. He was spinning a tragic tale, claiming that Kiera was a master manipulator who had secretly used his corporate access to steal the pension funds for her cosmetic clinic. He was actively throwing his own wife to the wolves, setting her up to take the full fall for his financial crimes. He truly believed that if he gathered his powerful peers and played the innocent, betrayed husband, his network would protect him, and the federal investigators would focus entirely on the black woman he had married. Kiera was actually there in the ballroom, standing near a tower of white roses, looking pale and utterly terrified. Her medical license had been suspended, and the feds had already raided her clinic, but she was still clinging to the delusion that Spencer was going to save her. She watched her husband schmooze with the financial titans, believing he was rallying support to pay for their legal defense. She had no idea she was the main course on his sacrificial menu. She was wearing a desperate smile, nodding at people who actively ignored her. She looked like a ghost of the arrogant woman who used to mock my cheap shoes and demand I serve her friends at parties. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the grand podium at the front of the ballroom, tapping the microphone to get the attention of the hundreds of wealthy guests. The orchestra fell silent, and the room grew quiet as the clinking of champagne glasses ceased. Spencer took his place at a prime table near the front, adjusting his cuffs and wearing a mask of noble suffering. He was waiting for the announcer to introduce the anonymous corporate sponsor who had funded the evening's extravagant charity matching program. Spencer had spent all week bragging that a major silent benefactor from his firm was backing his innocence and showing solidarity. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer said, his voice booming through the massive speakers. "Tonight we are gathered to celebrate accountability, integrity, and corporate responsibility. We are incredibly honored to be joined by the visionary who made tonight's matching donations possible. Please direct your attention to the stage and welcome the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Equity, Ms. Tiana Wilson." The applause started politely from the back of the room as I descended the velvet-lined staircase leading to the main stage. I was wearing a floor-length emerald green gown that flowed like liquid silk, radiating the kind of quiet, absolute power that these people respected. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, measured pace of a woman who owned the room. The polite applause began to falter and turn into confused murmurs as I stepped into the bright stage lights. I looked down at the front table. Spencer was frozen. His champagne glass stopped halfway to his mouth. The smug, confident mask melted off his face, leaving behind a look of pure, unadulterated horror. He had assumed his corporate allies had sponsored the gala to protect him. He had absolutely no idea that Apex Equity had silently purchased the Biltmore Hotel 2 days ago, and that I was the one pulling the strings of his entire theatrical production. Across the room, Kiera dropped her clutch purse. It hit the marble floor with a dull thud, but she did not bend to pick it up. She just stared at me, her jaw trembling as she finally realized that her little sister, the one she had called a low-wage failure, was the most powerful person in the room. "Good evening," I said, my voice smooth and commanding, echoing off the gold leaf ceilings. I stepped up to the crystal podium and looked directly into Spencer's panicked eyes. "I want to thank Spencer Hayes for organizing such a beautiful gathering to discuss corporate accountability and family loyalty. It takes a very special kind of man to stand before his peers and ask for sympathy while his hands are covered in stolen money." A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. The wealthy bankers and socialites shifted uncomfortably, setting down their drinks. Spencer gripped the edges of his table, his knuckles turning stark white. He opened his mouth to speak, to shout for security to stop me, but his vocal cords completely failed him. "Spencer has been telling a very moving story tonight. I continued pacing slowly across the stage, holding a small wireless remote in my hand. He has been telling his esteemed colleagues that he is a victim. He claims his wife Kiera manipulated his accounts and stole $2.5 million from a minority working-class pension fund without his knowledge. He is asking for your support and your resources to shield him from the federal investigations currently dismantling his life. Spencer violently pushed his chair back and stood up, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Turn off that microphone," he yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. "She is insane. She is a disgruntled former employee trying to ruin my family. Someone get security and throw her out of my gala right now." I pressed a button on the remote. The massive digital screens flanking the stage flickered to life, bathing the entire ballroom in a stark white light. The screens displayed high-resolution images of bank transfers, routing numbers, and corporate authorization forms. I did not raise my voice. I simply let the evidence speak for itself. "I am not a former employee, Spencer," I said calmly. "As the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Equity, I am your boss. And as of last week, I am the owner of Vanguard Trust. The documents you see behind me are the internal audit files retrieved directly from your personal encrypted server. They show exactly how you bypass security protocols to siphon pension funds over 36 months. You did not just look the other way while your wife stole money. You actively initiated every single transfer routing the cash through offshore accounts to clean it before dumping it into her medical clinic." The crowd erupted into shocked whispers. The men who had been patting Spencer on the back just 10 minutes ago were now physically stepping away from his table, putting distance between themselves and a radioactive criminal. Spencer looked around wildly, his chest heaving as the walls closed in on him. "It was her," he screamed, gesturing frantically toward Kiera, who was standing frozen by the roses. "She made me do it. She was desperate for capital. She manipulated the accounts. She is the one who bought the illegal medical supplies. I had nothing to do with it. She ruined me. She used my love to destroy my career." Kiera let out a strangled sob, shaking her head as the entire ballroom turned to look at her with absolute disgust. My own sister was experiencing the exact same betrayal she had inflicted on me for years. The man she thought gave her prestige was currently sacrificing her to a room full of strangers to save his own skin. "You are a very talented actor, Spencer," I said, my voice slicing through his panicked shouting. "But unfortunately for you, I also audited your personal corporate email accounts. I wanted to see exactly how much of a victim you really were." I clicked the remote again. The bank transfers on the massive screens vanished, replaced by blown-up screenshots of internal emails. They were messages Spencer had sent from his private Vanguard account to his old fraternity brothers and wealthy colleagues spanning over the last 2 years. The text was enlarged, so even the people in the back of the ballroom could read every single word perfectly. "Let us read what you told your friends about the woman you claim manipulated you," I said, stepping away from the podium so the crowd had a clear view of the screens. I read the first email aloud, letting my voice carry the heavy weight of his arrogance. I quote, "Do not worry about the audit committee. I found the perfect shield. I married into a family of stupid black gold diggers. My wife and her mother are so desperate to pretend they are part of the elite, they will sign anything I put in front of them. If the feds ever come sniffing around, I will just pin the missing pension funds on Kiera's shady cosmetic clinic. Who are they going to believe? A respected white executive from a legacy family, or a greedy ghetto doctor playing dress-up?" End quote. The silence that fell over the ballroom was absolute and suffocating. The sheer racist venom of his words hung in the air like poison. The elite white bankers who had been sympathizing with him moments ago stared at the screens in complete horror. Spencer was not just a thief, he was a liability, a disgusting bigot who had just exposed his true nature to the most powerful people in the state. I clicked to the next email. "And let us look at your thoughts on the working-class people you stole from." I continued, my voice dropping to a dangerous, chilling whisper. I quote, "Taking from the municipal minority pension is easy money. These people do not understand finance. They are just happy to have a retirement account. Skimming a few million is like taking candy from a blind baby. They will never notice, and even if they do, nobody cares about a bunch of low-income workers." End quote. Kiera let out a guttural, agonizing scream. Her knees buckled and she collapsed onto the marble floor, her pristine designer dress pooling around her. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, sobbing uncontrollably as the reality of her entire marriage shattered. Spencer had never loved her. He had never respected our mother. He had targeted Kiera specifically because her desperate need for validation made her the perfect disposable scapegoat. He had used her insecurities to build a trap, and now she was suffocating in it. Spencer was trembling so violently he had to grip the edge of his table to stay standing. He looked at the screens, reading his own racist, arrogant words illuminated for the entire world to see. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The smug corporate titan, the man who had told me to find a cheap apartment and welcome to the real world, was completely broken. "You thought your privilege made you invisible, Spencer," I said, looking down at him from the stage. "You thought you could steal from my community, degrade my family, and use your connections to crush anyone who stood in your way. But you made one fatal miscalculation. You underestimated me." At that exact moment, the heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open with a resounding crash. The flashing red and blue lights of emergency vehicles illuminated the hotel lobby through the glass windows. A dozen uniformed federal agents and local police officers marched into the room, their tactical boots loud against the marble floor. The crowd of wealthy socialites parted instantly, creating a wide, clear path directly to Spencer's table. "Spencer Hayes," an older federal agent said, stepping forward and flashing a gold badge. "We have warrants for your arrest regarding wire fraud, federal embezzlement, and the illegal distribution of unlicensed medical materials. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." Spencer's eyes widened in sheer panic. He looked at the federal agents, then up at me, standing on the stage in my emerald gown. He realized in that agonizing moment that no one was going to save him. His wealth, his connections, his race, none of it mattered anymore. He had been completely outplayed by the very woman he had called a failure. "No," Spencer gasped, stumbling backward, knocking over his chair. "No, wait, I can explain. It was her." He pointed wildly at Kiera, who was still weeping on the floor. "She made me do it. You have to believe me." Two officers grabbed his arms, twisting them roughly behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the silent ballroom was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. They patted him down, ignoring his frantic, pathetic whimpering. As they began to drag him heavily toward the exit, Spencer twisted his neck to look back at Kiera. His face was contorted into a mask of pure feral hatred. The charming husband facade was completely gone, leaving only a cornered, vicious animal. "Do not think you are walking away from this, you stupid bitch!" Spencer screamed, his voice tearing through the elegant room as the officers pulled him backward. "You took the money. Your signature is on the shell company forms. I am not taking the fall for this alone. Do you hear me, Kiera? I am dragging you down to hell with me." The heavy doors slammed shut behind him, cutting off his hysterical screams. The ballroom remained completely silent, except for the sound of Kiera's desperate gasping sobs on the floor. The elite guests stared at her with a mixture of pity and absolute revulsion. She had lost her medical license, her husband, her wealth, and any shred of dignity she had ever possessed. I stood at the crystal podium, looking out over the devastation. I had burned their fake empire to ash. But as I watched Kiera rocking back and forth on the marble floor, I knew the final reckoning for the family legacy was still waiting back at the estate. I left the Biltmore Hotel through the private VIP exit as the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the grand marble facade. The valet brought my town car around, and I sank into the plush leather seats, feeling a profound sense of closure regarding Spencer. But my mind was already shifting to the final pieces of the puzzle. The sky above Atlanta was turning a bruised, violent purple as heavy storm clouds began to roll in from the west. The air was thick with the threat of rain mirroring the storm that had battered my daughter Brielle just weeks ago. I arrived back at the Four Seasons penthouse just as the first heavy drops of water began to smash against the floor-to-ceiling windows. I checked on Brielle, who was sound asleep in her bedroom wrapped in a warm, thick blanket. I stood in the doorway watching her peaceful chest rise and fall, knowing she would never have to shiver in the cold again. My phone vibrated on the kitchen island. It was an incoming call from the building's head of security. I answered the call and the guard's voice sounded hesitant. "Ms. Wilson, I apologize for the late hour," he said, "but there is a woman at the private residential gate. She slipped past the outer perimeter before the gates closed, and she is refusing to leave. She claims to be your sister, and she is demanding to speak with you. We can have the police remove her for trespassing if you prefer." I walked slowly toward the expansive glass doors leading to my private wraparound balcony. "Do not call the police," I instructed the guard. "Let her stay right where she is." I pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped out into the biting wind. The rain was falling in absolute sheets now, washing over the city in a torrential downpour. I walked to the edge of the balcony and looked down at the private entrance gate 3 stories below. There she was. Kiara was kneeling on the wet concrete, her pristine designer dress completely ruined and plastered to her skin. Her perfect hair was a tangled, matted mess clinging to her face. The irony was incredibly poetic. The proud, wealthy plastic surgeon who had stood on a country club terrace hours ago mocking my clothes and my career was now shivering in the mud, exactly like the helpless 9-year-old girl she had locked out of her house. Tiana Kiera screamed, her voice barely carrying over the roar of the thunderstorm. She tilted her head back, looking up at my balcony. "Please, Tiana, you have to help me." I stood under the protective overhang of the roof, completely dry, looking down at the pathetic creature below me. "They froze all my bank accounts!" Kiara sobbed hysterically, the rain washing the expensive makeup down her face in dark, muddy streaks. "The feds seized everything. Spencer's assets are gone and his lawyers will not even answer my calls. I have absolutely nothing left, Tiana. You have to give me money for a defense attorney. You have millions of dollars. You can afford the best legal team in the state. We are family, Tiana. We are sisters. You cannot just leave me out here to drown." I listened to her weaponize the word sisterhood. It was the ultimate insult. She had spent my entire life treating me like a disease, an unwanted burden that tarnished her perfect image. She had stood by and watched our mother steal my inheritance to fund her fraudulent life. And now that she was facing federal prison, she suddenly remembered we shared the same blood. I turned around and walked back inside the penthouse. I went to the entry closet and opened the door. Sitting in the corner was the exact same broken, flimsy umbrella that Beatrice had thrown at Brielle on the day she evicted us. I had kept it as a reminder, a physical manifestation of their cruelty. I grabbed the cold metal handle and walked back out onto the balcony. Kiara was still sobbing on the concrete below, hugging her arms around her chest as the freezing rain battered her body. "Please, sister," she wailed, "have mercy on me." I leaned over the glass railing and dropped the broken umbrella. It fell through the pouring rain and landed with a loud clatter on the wet pavement, right next to Kiara's muddy knees. She flinched, staring down at the useless piece of torn fabric and bent metal. Where was this deep, sisterly bond when my 9-year-old daughter was freezing in the rain? "Kiara," I asked, my voice echoing sharply down into the courtyard. "Where was your mercy when Mom threw my child onto the street while you cheered her on? You wanted to play the elite corporate game using stolen money and ruined lives to build your pedestal. Now you get to pay the price. Welcome to the real world, sister." I did not wait for her to respond. I turned around, stepped back into the warmth of the penthouse, and locked the heavy glass doors behind me, shutting out the sound of her miserable wailing. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a fresh glass of sparkling water. The silence of the apartment was beautiful. But the peace did not last long. Exactly 10 minutes later, my private cell phone began to ring. I checked the caller identification and saw our mother's name flashing on the screen. Beatrice had never called my private number. She had spent years actively pretending I did not exist. I set my glass down and tapped the screen to answer, making sure to press the record button on my secondary tablet. I wanted every single word of this documented. "Tiana." My mother's voice was a frantic, desperate whisper. "Please tell me you are listening." "I am listening, Mother," I replied calmly. "I saw the news alerts." Beatrice babbled, her words tumbling over each other in sheer panic. I know they arrested Spencer, and I know Kiara is going down for the clinic fraud. The feds were at the house an hour ago asking questions about the offshore accounts and the medical school bribes. Tiana, you have to listen to me. I had nothing to do with any of this. I raised an eyebrow at her blatant cowardice. You had nothing to do with stealing my inheritance to buy her medical degree. It was her idea, Beatrice cried out, throwing her own flesh and blood directly under the bus without a second of hesitation. Kiara manipulated me, Tiana. She told me to take the money. She is the one who set up the fake clinic and worked with Spencer. I am just an innocent older woman. I did not know what they were doing. The absolute treachery was staggering. Kiara was currently outside in the rain begging for her life, and Beatrice was inside the stolen mansion offering her up as a sacrificial lamb. What exactly do you want, Mother? I asked, keeping my voice deadpan. I will testify against her. Beatrice offered, her voice dropping lower, as if someone might overhear her in the empty house. I will tell the federal prosecutors everything. I will be your star witness. I will swear under oath that Kiara was the mastermind behind the entire operation. I will hand them the bank records showing she forced me to bribe the medical board. I will give you everything you need to lock her away for decades. And what do you want in exchange for selling out your golden child? I asked, already knowing the answer. Just let me keep the house. Beatrice pleaded, a pathetic whine creeping into her voice. Cancel the eviction notice, Tiana. Transfer the deed back into my name and drop the fraud charges against me regarding the church charity money. Let me keep my status in the community, and I will give you Kiara on a silver platter. You win, Tiana. Just please do not take my home. I looked at the recording software on my tablet, watching the audio waves capture every single treacherous syllable of her proposal. The matriarch, who cared about nothing but optics, was willing to send her favorite daughter to federal prison just to keep a colonial mansion and her country club membership. It was the most despicable display of human greed I had ever witnessed, and I had it all permanently saved on a digital file. I let a slow, dark smile spread across my face as I stared at the flashing red recording light. I tapped the screen ending the call and immediately saved the audio file. I did not wait for the morning. I attached the crystal-clear recording of our mother bargaining away her favorite daughter's freedom to a message and sent it directly to Kiara's phone. I knew she was still out there in the freezing rain, desperately trying to figure out her next move. I imagined the notification lighting up her screen in the dark. I imagined her shivering hands pressing play. I imagined the absolute devastation as she heard the woman who had worshipped her for decades offer her up to federal prosecutors like a piece of cheap meat. The fallout was swift and spectacular. By noon the next day, my private investigator informed me that Beatrice and Kiara had called an emergency meeting at the offices of a high-profile criminal defense firm downtown. They were desperately trying to pool their non-existent resources to hire a team of ruthless lawyers. I decided to make an unannounced appearance. Since I legally owned the debt on the family estate, and Vanguard Trust was formally pressing charges against Spencer and Kiara, for the embezzlement, my presence as the primary creditor was practically required. I walked into the sleek glass conference room of the law firm just in time to witness the total destruction of the perfect family. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me, sealing us in. Beatrice and Kiara were sitting on opposite ends of a long, polished mahogany table. Two very exhausted-looking defense attorneys were trying to moderate what had clearly devolved into a vicious screaming match. "How could you do this to me?" Kiara shrieked, slamming her fist against the table. Her eyes were bloodshot and swollen, her pristine image completely shattered. She pointed a shaking finger at our mother. "I heard the recording, you treacherous old hag. You told Tiana you would testify against me. You told her you would say I was the mastermind just so you could keep your stupid house." Beatrice shot out of her chair, her face purple with rage. "Do not you dare speak to me that way, you ungrateful child," she screamed back, her refined country club accent completely abandoning her. "I gave you everything. I bought your medical degree. I covered up your failures. And what did you do? You and your idiot husband dragged the federal government to my front door. You ruined my reputation. I will not go to prison for your sloppy criminal mistakes, Kiara. I will tell the district attorney exactly what you did. You are the one who stole Tiana's trust fund to bribe the medical board. Kiera fired back, her voice echoing off the glass walls. I have the bank routing numbers saved on my phone, Mom. If I am going down, I am making sure the prosecutors know you initiated the original wire transfers. I will tell them you forced me to do it. The two defense attorneys exchanged a look of pure dread, realizing their clients were actively confessing to multiple federal felonies on the record in front of each other and in front of me. They tried to intervene, waving their hands and demanding silence, but the mother and daughter were too far gone. They were like two cornered animals tearing each other to pieces to survive. I need an immunity deal, Kiera demanded, turning wildly to one of the lawyers. Tell the federal prosecutors I will wear a wire. I will give them Spencer, and I will give them my mother. I just need blanket immunity. Do not listen to her, Beatrice yelled, gripping the edge of the table. I am the mother. I am a respected community leader. Get me the immunity deal. I will hand over all of Kiera's fake medical supply invoices. I know where she hides the black market ledgers. I stood quietly near the entrance, watching the two women who had spent my entire life telling me I was worthless absolutely destroy each other. There was no loyalty. There was no sisterhood. There was no maternal love. Beneath the designer clothes and the projected wealth, there was nothing but toxic self-preservation. I took a few slow steps toward the table, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor. The sound finally drew their attention. They stopped screaming and turned to look at me, panting heavily, their chests heaving with exertion. There are no immunity deals, I said, my voice dropping into the quiet room like a heavy stone. The lawyers looked at me warily, but Beatrice and Kiera just stared. What are you talking about? Kiera sneered, though her voice lacked its usual venom. You do not control the federal prosecutors, Tiana. You do not get to decide who gets immunity. I do not control the prosecutors. I agreed calmly, smoothing the front of my suit jacket. But I do control the evidence, and I control the money. You see, the feds only offer immunity when they need help building a case. But they do not need your help. Through the Vanguard Trust audit, I have already handed them a perfectly wrapped package containing every single wire transfer, every fake invoice, every deleted email, and every offshore routing number you and Spencer ever used. The federal investigators already have a bulletproof case against all of you. You have absolutely zero leverage to trade. Beatrice sank slowly back into her leather chair, the blood draining from her face. Tiana, please, she whispered, her voice cracking. You cannot do this. We are your family. We are your blood. I looked at the woman who had given birth to me, feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a profound sense of empty clarity. We stopped being family the moment you locked Brielle in that storm, I replied. And as of this morning, we are not even legally tied together anymore. I reached into my briefcase and tossed a thick stack of manila folders onto the center of the mahogany table. They slid across the polished wood, stopping right between my mother and my sister. I spent the morning with my own legal team. I explained, watching them stare at the folders as if they were venomous snakes. I bought out all of your remaining debts. The credit cards, the personal loans, the auto leases. Everything you now owe to my holding company. I have officially frozen every single line of credit you have left. You cannot buy a cup of coffee without my authorization. And those documents also contain the final paperwork legally severing my familial ties and obligations to you both. You are completely isolated. Kiera let out a small broken whimper, covering her mouth with her hands. Beatrice looked like she had aged 20 years in 20 seconds. Her eyes were vacant, staring blankly at the legal documents that signaled the absolute end of her reign. I did not stay to watch them cry. I turned and walked out of the conference room, leaving them trapped in the glass box with the expensive lawyers they could no longer afford to pay. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of corporate restructuring and quiet satisfaction. I spent my days at Vanguard Trust cleaning out the rot Spencer had left behind and securing the pension funds for the working-class families who had trusted the firm. I spent my evenings with Brielle, ordering her favorite desserts and watching her laugh freely, without the shadow of my mother's judgment hanging over her. And then finally, the clock ran out. It was a crisp, bright Tuesday morning. The 72-hour eviction notice I had served to Beatrice had officially expired at exactly 8 in the morning. I was sitting in the back of my chauffeured town car, parked discreetly at the end of the long, oak-lined driveway leading up to the grand colonial estate. The historical mansion looked beautiful in the morning light, its white pillars gleaming against the red brick. It was the house I had grown up in, the house where I had been made to feel like a ghost, the house I now entirely owned. Right on time, two white county sheriff cruisers pulled up the street, their tires crunching loudly over the gravel driveway. They bypassed the manicured lawns and parked directly in front of the heavy mahogany double doors. Four uniformed deputies stepped out of the vehicles, pulling on thick black tactical gloves and carrying heavy metal clipboards. A massive commercial moving truck pulled in right behind them, parking awkwardly on the pristine grass. I rolled down the tinted window of my car, letting the cool morning breeze drift in as I watched the scene unfold. The lead deputy, a tall, broad-shouldered man, walked up the brick steps and raised his fist. He pounded on the front door with a heavy, authoritative rhythm that echoed across the quiet, affluent neighborhood. "County Sheriff," the deputy shouted, his voice booming through the crisp air. "We have a court-ordered eviction. Open the door immediately." There was no answer. The massive house remained completely silent. The deputy did not wait. He pounded again, harder this time. "Open the door, or we will force entry. Your 72-hour notice has expired." I watched from the shadows of my car as the brass handle slowly turned. The heavy mahogany door creaked open, revealing the dark, empty hallway inside. The final reckoning had arrived. For a single split second, the hallway remained perfectly still. Then Beatrice and Kiera lunged out from the shadows of the foyer like terrified rodents fleeing a sinking ship. The moment my mother saw the four uniformed deputies and the massive commercial moving truck, her eyes widened in sheer, unfiltered panic. She let out a guttural shriek and threw her entire body weight against the heavy wood, slamming the door shut right in the deputies' faces. I could hear the sharp metallic clack of the deadbolt sliding into place, followed immediately by the heavy thud of furniture being dragged aggressively across the polished marble floor. They were actually trying to barricade themselves inside a house they no longer owned. Beatrice began screaming at the top of her lungs through the thick wooden door. "You cannot do this!" she shrieked, her voice trembling with manic desperation and misplaced authority. "We are high-class citizens of this community. We are the Hayes family. We belong in this neighborhood, and you have absolutely no right to touch our property. I know the mayor personally, and I will sue every single one of you for harassment and emotional distress." Kara chimed in from behind the heavy mahogany, her voice cracking as she childishly threatened the armed officers. "My husband is a corporate executive," she wailed, completely ignoring the fact that Spencer was currently sitting in a cold federal holding cell, facing decades in prison. "We have a team of elite lawyers. We will ruin your careers and take your pensions. Go away and leave us alone before I call the police chief." The lead deputy just sighed and shook his head, stepping back from the porch with a look of absolute boredom. He had clearly dealt with entitled, delusional criminals before. He signaled to the moving crew, who immediately marched forward, carrying a heavy solid steel battering ram. The deputy warned them one last time, stepping up to the wood. "Step away from the door, ladies, because we are coming in right now." There was another hysterical scream from Beatrice, followed by the sound of breaking glass from inside the foyer. The deputies swung the ram backward and thrust it forward with incredible force. The loud splintering crash of the reinforced mahogany breaking apart echoed loudly down the quiet, affluent street. The door flew open with a violent crack, sending the heavy antique console table they had used as a barricade sliding across the foyer and smashing into the grand staircase. The officers swarmed inside their heavy tactical boots, trampling all over the pristine imported silk rugs my mother loved so much. I stepped out of my town car, pulling my dark designer coat tight against the crisp morning chill as I walked slowly up the gravel driveway. The process of dismantling their fake empire was incredibly efficient and utterly breathtaking to witness. The moving crew flooded into the colonial estate, carrying out boxes and furniture with ruthless mechanical speed. I stood on the manicured front lawn watching as they brought out the antique velvet sofas, the crystal lamps, and the heavy oak dining room chairs. For years, Beatrice had hosted extravagant dinner parties in that room using stolen money to feed people who did not even like her. Now those same chairs were being tossed carelessly into the back of a dirty moving truck. Kiara was dragged out the front door by two female deputies kicking and screaming like a petulant toddler throwing a tantrum. Her makeup was smeared across her face, and her hair was a wild, tangled mess. She was clutching a handful of designer silk dresses, refusing to let go, until an officer firmly pried her manicured fingers open. They dropped the expensive dresses into a cheap cardboard box right onto the wet morning grass. "Do not touch my clothes!" Kiara sobbed, falling to her knees on the lawn. "Those are custom-made. You cannot treat me like this. I am a doctor. I am a respectable woman. You are an unemployed fraud facing federal indictment." An officer replied flatly, stepping over her to grab another box of shoes. "Stay behind the property line, Mom, or you will be arrested for interfering with a court-ordered eviction." Beatrice stumbled out onto the porch moments later, her appearance completely shattered. Her hair was wildly disheveled, and her expensive silk robe was falling off her shoulders. She looked like a madwoman, completely devoid of the arrogant prestige she had clung to her entire life. The movers were currently carrying out her most prized possessions, tossing them unceremoniously onto the front lawn. They brought out boxes of her expensive designer shoes, her customized leather handbags, and her imported jewelry boxes, stacking them in a massive, chaotic pile on the curb. "No!" Beatrice wailed, dropping to her knees on the grass next to Kiara. "You cannot put my things out here in the dirt. The neighbors will see. Everyone will see. Stop it right now. I command you to stop." Her worst nightmare was coming true in real time. The wealthy neighbors from the surrounding colonial mansions were already stepping out onto their grand porches and gathering on the sidewalks to watch the spectacle. The same elite women Beatrice had desperately tried to impress were now sipping their morning coffee and whispering to each other as my mother wept in the dirt. Her entire social standing was being publicly eradicated. She looked up and locked eyes with me as I walked past the pile of her ruined dignity. I stopped perfectly out of reach, letting her take in the harsh reality of my presence. Two workers carried out a large, heavy wooden post with a freshly painted metal sign attached to the top. They walked right past Beatrice, ignoring her hysterical sobbing, and hammered the heavy wooden stake directly into the center of her perfectly manicured front lawn. The sign read in bold, unmistakable letters, "Property of Tiana Wilson. No trespassing." Beatrice stared at the sign, reading my name over and over again, as the reality of her total defeat finally crushed whatever pride she had left. I stood above her, looking down at the woman who had traded my childhood for a country club membership. She was completely broken, kneeling in the dirt, surrounded by a pile of useless, expensive garbage that she had bought with stolen funds. Kiara was sitting on a crushed cardboard box beside her, sobbing into her hands, as she realized her medical career and her wealth were completely permanently erased. She had mocked my cheap shoes and my humble apartment for years. Now she was sitting on the curb, with absolutely nowhere to go. Beatrice slowly pulled herself up from the grass, wiping her muddy, trembling hands on her ruined silk robe. Her eyes were burning with a feral, toxic hatred that she could no longer hide behind a polite society smile. She glared at me, her chest heaving as the deputies warned her to stay behind the property line. She looked like a venomous snake preparing for one final desperate strike. "You think you have won!" "Tiana?" Beatrice snarled, her voice dripping with absolute venom as she pointed a shaking finger at my face. "You think buying my house makes you powerful? You think destroying your own mother and your sister makes you some kind of corporate titan? You are still nothing to us. You will always be the outcast of this family." I stood perfectly still, letting her empty words wash over me without feeling a single ounce of emotion. "You can take my home." Beatrice continued, her voice rising to a hysterical screech for all the neighbors to hear. "You can take our money, and you can take our belongings, but you will never be accepted by the extended family. They all know what you did to us today. They all know you are a ruthless, vindictive monster, who turned her back on her own blood. You will never have a place at our table, Tiana. You will never be one of us. I looked at the pathetic, desperate woman shivering on the curb. She was still clinging to the delusion that her family name carried any weight in the real world. She truly believed that the wealthy uncles and elite cousins who had ignored me my entire life would somehow rally to her defense and cast me out. I let out a slow, soft laugh, the sound cutting sharply through the cold morning air. I took a step closer to the property line, looking directly into my mother's panicked, furious eyes. I do not need to be accepted by the extended family. Beatrice, I replied, my voice ringing with quiet, absolute authority. I do not want a seat at their table because I just bought the entire dining room. Beatrice froze, her mouth opening slightly as the confusion washed over her face. Kiera stopped sobbing and looked up at me, her eyes wide with dread. I purchased the controlling stake in the family joint pharmaceutical venture last night, I explained, watching the color completely drain from my mother's face. The massive corporate conglomerate that your brothers and your cousins pride themselves on. The legacy company that funded all of their private jets and their summer homes. I own 51% of the voting shares as of midnight. Beatrice stumbled backward, shaking her head in complete denial. No, she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. You cannot. They would never sell to you. They did not know they were selling to me, I said, offering her a cold, merciless smile. I used a network of anonymous Vanguard Trust shell companies to aggressively buy out the panicked minority shareholders who were drowning in their own private debts. I tracked their over-leveraged real estate deals and their failing side businesses, and I offered them a highly lucrative way out. By the time your arrogant brothers realized what was happening, the hostile takeover was already completely locked in. I am calling an emergency board meeting tomorrow morning to restructure the entire executive team and strip them of their bloated salaries. Your brothers, your cousins, your entire bloodline, who looked down on me and called me a low-wage failure, they all work for me now. Kiara let out a strangled gasp, covering her face as she realized the true magnitude of my victory. I had not just destroyed their immediate household, I had conquered the entire family dynasty. And just so we are completely clear, Beatrice, I added, turning to walk back toward my waiting town car. My first act as the new majority shareholder will be to freeze all family dividends and launch a comprehensive internal audit. So do not expect your brothers to offer you a place to stay tonight. They are going to be far too busy begging me to keep their jobs. I opened the door to my car and slid into the warm leather seat, leaving them shivering on the curb as the moving truck drove away with the last remnants of their fake empire. The deputies pushed past the shattered mahogany doors and the real work began. I sat in the quiet comfort of my town car, watching as a dozen burly movers systematically stripped the colonial estate of its history. They carried out the massive oak dining table where I had been forced to eat in silence for years, while Beatrice praised Kiera for her mediocre achievements. They dragged out the antique grandfather clock and the imported silk rugs, rolling them up like cheap discarded carpets. They carried out the massive oil painting of Beatrice that used to hang above the grand fireplace, leaving the walls completely bare and echoing with emptiness. Beatrice and Kiera stood on the curb, shivering in the morning air, surrounded by a growing mountain of their displaced possessions. The neighbors they had spent decades trying to impress were now standing on their immaculate lawns, pointing and whispering behind manicured hands. I watched my mother fall to her knees, weeping loudly as a worker hammered a wooden sign into her perfect grass, declaring the property officially mine. The sheer public humiliation was absolute and irreversible. I tapped the glass partition, and my driver slowly pulled away, leaving them to drown in the ruin they had so carefully constructed. 6 months later, the federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta was packed with reporters and disgraced investors. The trial of Spencer Hayes had been the media spectacle of the year. I sat in the back row of the gallery wearing a tailored ivory suit, projecting nothing but calm observation. Spencer was led into the courtroom wearing a bright orange jumpsuit and heavy iron shackles around his wrists and ankles. The rhythmic clinking of the chains echoed through the silent room. He looked completely unrecognizable. The arrogant golden boy of the corporate finance world was completely gone. His face was gaunt, his blonde hair was thinning rapidly, and his shoulders were slumped under the crushing weight of his reality. His high-priced lawyers had abandoned him months ago when the retainer funds ran dry, leaving him with a public defender who looked completely exhausted and entirely unbothered by his fate. The federal judge, a stern woman with absolutely no patience for white-collar criminals, did not hesitate. She read aloud the staggering list of his crimes detailing the millions he had stolen from working-class families to fund his lavish lifestyle and Kiera's fraudulent cosmetic clinic. Spencer wept openly in the courtroom, begging for mercy, citing his privileged upbringing and his previous standing in the community as reasons for leniency. The judge simply stared down at him with pure disgust. She slammed her heavy wooden gavel down and sentenced him to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. As the court bailiffs dragged him away, he locked eyes with me across the crowded room. There was no rage left in him, just a hollow, terrifying emptiness. He knew his life was effectively over, and he knew I was the one who had buried him. Kiera did not fare much better in the aftermath. The medical board had permanently stripped her of her license before the federal trial even began, citing gross negligence and her active participation in the fraudulent billing schemes. Her cosmetic clinic was seized by the government and liquidated to pay back a fraction of the massive restitution she owed the victims. Without Spencer to fund her extravagant lifestyle and without her fake medical credentials, her descent into poverty was brutally fast. One Tuesday afternoon, I instructed my driver to take a detour through a rundown neighborhood on the extreme outskirts of the city. I walked into a dingy discount grocery store where the fluorescent lights buzzed loudly and flickered overhead. The air smelled of cheap bleach and overripe produce. I stood near the faded magazine rack and watched the checkout lanes. There she was. Kiera was wearing a terrible stiff polyester uniform shirt with a plastic name tag pinned crookedly to her chest. Her perfectly manicured nails were gone, replaced by chipped polish and raw, bleeding cuticles. She was scanning canned beans and cheap frozen dinners for a long line of impatient customers. A woman with 2 screaming toddlers snapped at her to hurry up, and Kiera just ducked her head, apologizing nervously as she fumbled with the thin plastic bags. The arrogant elite surgeon, who used to mock my clothes and tell me I was a pathetic failure, was now earning minimum wage and asking people if they had store loyalty cards. A voice crackled over the terrible intercom system, demanding that Kiera clean up a spill on aisle 4. She flinched, closing her eyes in sheer humiliation before grabbing a dirty mop bucket. She looked utterly exhausted and completely stripped of her venom and her pride. I watched her push the mop across the cracked linoleum floor, feeling a deep, satisfying peace before turning around and walking back out to my waiting car. Beatrice had fallen the farthest of them all. The woman who had built her entire identity around high society status and colonial mansions was now living in a dilapidated, subsidized apartment complex on the industrial side of town. The extended family she was so certain would save her had completely turned their backs on her the exact moment I took control of the pharmaceutical venture. I had frozen all of their dividends and initiated a brutal restructuring process. They were terrified of losing their own wealth, so they treated Beatrice like a contagious disease, cutting off her phone calls and permanently banning her from their country club events. She was a liability, and in their ruthless world, liabilities were instantly discarded. I had received detailed reports from my private investigators documenting her miserable new life. Her tiny apartment smelled of stale cooking oil and damp, rotting wood. The cheap floral wallpaper was peeling in thick strips, and the rusted pipes rattled loudly inside the thin walls every time someone turned on a faucet. She spent her days sitting in a cheap vinyl armchair, clutching a string of fake pearls, and staring blankly at a small television screen. She had alienated every single person who had ever loved her. She had no friends, no money, and absolutely no legacy to protect. Her mind was slowly fracturing under the crushing weight of her total isolation. My investigators reported that she would wander down to the complex lobby wearing her moth-eaten silk robe and tell anyone who would listen that she was a wealthy matriarch. She would corner the delivery drivers and the maintenance workers, insisting that there had been a terrible mistake and that she actually belonged in a grand mansion. The other tenants just ignored her, treating her like a crazy, delusional old woman living in a fake past. She was suffocating in the exact same crushing poverty she had always despised and mocked. It was the absolute perfect poetic justice for a woman who worshipped money above her own children. A year later, the air was warm and smelled of sea salt and blooming jasmine. I was sitting on the expansive terrace of a private luxury villa overlooking the sparkling azure waters of the Mediterranean Sea. The sun was slowly setting, casting a brilliant golden glow over the rugged cliffs of the Amalfi Coast. A gentle breeze blew in from the water, carrying the distant sound of expensive yachts cutting through the waves. I took a slow sip of imported sparkling water, resting my head against the plush white cushions of the teak lounge chair. My private chef was inside preparing a massive feast of fresh local seafood and roasted vegetables. Down below on the private white sand beach, Brielle was running along the shoreline, chasing the gentle waves as they rolled onto the sand. Her joyful, innocent laughter floated up to the terrace, bright and completely carefree. She was wearing a beautiful yellow sundress, her dark curls bouncing in the ocean breeze as she gathered smooth, colorful seashells in a small woven basket. She was safe, she was happy, and she had absolutely everything she could ever want or need. There were no more cold nights sleeping in the rain. There were no more hand-me-down clothes and no more terrifying sudden evictions. We had built an impenetrable empire of peace and absolute financial security. I watched my daughter play in the warm sand, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of triumph radiating through my entire being. I had protected my child, and I had ruthlessly dismantled every single monster that had ever tried to harm us. A soft buzzing sound suddenly interrupted the quiet, rhythmic crash of the ocean waves. I picked up my private cell phone from the glass patio table. The screen illuminated, showing a long, incoming text message from an unknown number. I did not recognize the digits, but as I began to read the massive block of text, the frantic, desperate tone was unmistakably familiar. It was Beatrice. She had somehow managed to track down my secure private number. "Tiana, please." She had written the words reeking of pathetic groveling and intense misery. "I know I made terrible mistakes. I know I was wrong about you and Kiera. I am so sorry for everything I did to you and Brielle all those years ago. It is so cold in this awful apartment and I have nothing left to eat. My health is failing and Kiera will not even answer my calls anymore. I am your mother, Tiana. Please find it in your heart to forgive me. Give me a second chance to be a real family. I am begging you on my hands and knees. Do not let me die in this horrible place like this. Let me see my beautiful granddaughter. Please, sister. Please, daughter, you have to help me." I stared at the glowing screen, reading the miserable, desperate pleas of the woman who had happily thrown me and my child to the wolves without a single ounce of hesitation. She was hoping for a moment of weakness, hoping that the toxic societal pressure of family forgiveness would finally break my resolve. She wanted me to swoop in and save her from the miserable hell she had dug for herself with her own two hands. She wanted the unconditional love she had explicitly denied me my entire life. I looked up from the screen, watching Brielle happily construct a massive sandcastle in the warm Mediterranean sun. My daughter stood up and waved at me, a huge, bright smile illuminating her beautiful face. I smiled and waved back, my heart completely full and entirely at peace. I looked back down at the phone resting in the palm of my hand. There would be no toxic forgiveness today or any other day. There would be no second chances for abusers who only apologize when they run out of money and victims. I gently tapped the screen, selecting the block caller option. The pathetic message vanished into the digital void, permanently severing the very last invisible thread that connected us. I smiled softly, closing my phone and tossing it casually back onto the glass table. The evening sky above the ocean was perfectly clear, and for the first time in my entire life, so was my future. The true lesson of this journey is that your worth is never determined by people who are committed to misunderstanding you for years. The protagonist allowed her toxic family to diminish her value because she believed blood demanded loyalty. But she eventually learned that walking away from chronic abuse is an act of profound self-love. Family should be a safe harbor, not a battlefield where you constantly have to prove your right to exist. Real power comes from cutting toxic ties, building your own independent sanctuary, and refusing to offer unearned forgiveness to those who intentionally destroy your peace. If this story of overcoming family betrayal inspired you, please share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to our channel for more empowering narratives.